Welcome everyone to the first official webinar training session for the Climate Resilience Roadmap for Ontario Municipal Infrastructure and Systems, developed by the Regional Public Works Commissioners of Ontario, or RPWCO. My name is Shelley Hazen, and I'm a climate change specialist with GEI Savanta, and today I'm joined by Glenn Milner from the Climate Risk Institute. We're also joined today by Carrie Marshall, the General Manager of Infrastructure and Operations for the City of Thunder Bay and Commissioner Lead for RPWCO's work on climate change adaptation. Carrie is going to kick this session off with a few words about the Roadmap Initiative. Thanks for joining, Carrie.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Shelley, for the introduction. So as Shelley noted, my name is Carrie Marshall, and I'm the General Manager of the Infrastructure and Operations Department with the City of Thunder Bay. And I'm also the Commissioner Lead for the Regional Public Works Commissioners of Ontario Climate Change Initiatives. RPWCO is an association of the Public Works Commissioners for Ontario's largest single-tier municipalities and regions. Collectively, members are responsible for infrastructure and services for over 80% of Ontario's population, including water and wastewater systems, roads and bridges, and waste and recycling facilities. RPWCO members collaborate to address common challenges, and climate change is one of the most pressing challenges we face. Flooding, extreme storms, and other climate hazards present increasing and evolving risks to infrastructure systems, services, and communities. And municipalities need to understand their local risks to plan and prioritize appropriate responses. However, conducting a climate risk assessment can be a complex and intensive process. Lack of guidance was identified as a significant challenge. To address this need, RPWCO has produced the Climate Resilience Roadmap for Municipal Infrastructure and Systems. The roadmap consolidates best practices to guide municipalities through a structured and scalable process for assessing and prioritizing climate risks across different asset categories. At this time, I would like to thank all of those who contributed to the creation of the roadmap, including our consulting team from Savanta GEI, the Climate Risk Institute, and Ramble, all of the RPWCO commissioners and climate change subcommittee members. And I would also like to thank Nicola Crawhall from Westbrook Public Affairs for all her work in assisting us through this process. At this time, I would now like to pass it back over to Shelley and Glenn, who will provide you with an overview of the roadmap.
Thanks very much, Carrie. So as I mentioned, this recording is part of a workshop series. So today's session will provide you with an overview of the roadmap in its entirety. The subsequent videos are going to provide greater detail on each of the steps and available resources and activities that can be found in this guide. So what is the RPWCO roadmap? The roadmap is really an approach for municipalities to address climate risks on infrastructure and systems by building off of existing best practices. It was created to help municipal staff who know that there's a tremendous amount of work to do to build resilient infrastructure, but may be intimidated by the undertaking or really unsure of where to start. So some of you may not know what climate scenarios to apply, what standard to protect to, how to scope the work, or maybe how to go about prioritizing the projects. Well, RPWCO had the same questions. So that's why we designed this roadmap to help you overcome some of these common challenges. And whether you're doing the work yourself or you're purchasing services to complete certain aspects of the climate change infrastructure assessment for you, this guide is going to give you the knowledge and confidence to help navigate some of this unfamiliar terrain. Now, the roadmap provides a municipality with guidance on how to undertake stakeholder engagement, develop an inventory of assets in support of delivering levels of service, how to obtain climate projections and scenarios, undertake a risk assessment, prioritize adaptation projects based on the results of that assessments, and also how to secure municipal support through the development of an effective business case through these series of steps that are illustrated on this slide. So why should you use the roadmap? Well, undertaking a risk assessment can be a bit of a burdensome process. The The roadmap now presents an opportunity to support users with step-by-step guidance to assist with identifying relevant risks and planning for resilience. So even if your municipality has not experienced serious climate impacts yet, the future scenario suggests that they are coming. And whether these are intense heat waves, cold snaps, windstorms, droughts, or floods, we're seeing these changes from what we've been experiencing historically. So some municipalities will be at greater risk than others, but none have zero risk. So until you undertake a risk assessment, you really don't know what to prepare for. So the roadmap, it helps municipalities find efficiencies through assessing climate risk to infrastructure at the systems level. It helps meet regulatory requirements to incorporate climate change into asset management, such as Ontario Regulation 58817. It's practical. It provides substantial guidance and activities to make meaningful progress on climate resilience. It also enables you to build a business case for resilient investments. Now, municipalities are facing greater threats from a changing climate. The City of Windsor has experienced substantial impacts from flooding, and the economic impacts of these events have been significant. Around 69% of residents who provided details on flooding noted that they faced over $10,000 in damages, while 17% had upwards of $50,000 in damages. Now, some Windsor residents paid for these damages with personal savings, others paid through insurance, but some indicated that they could actually not pay for the damages to their homes and property. And only a very small fraction, about 0.6%, actually received government assistance for repair and damage costs. Now, in 2016, another storm in Windsor recorded 2,850 flooding calls from residents. There was $108 million in reported insured losses, and this cost the city around $281,000 to respond. These numbers went up significantly when Windsor experienced another flood event in 2017. There were nearly 6,000 flood calls this time from residents, $125 million in insured losses. And some people who were previously insured for the 2016 storm lost coverage prior to the 2017 storm. The city's response costs went up to nearly $1.7 million this time. So based on the results of the Partners for Action survey completed by residents in Windsor, only 44% of those affected by the flood paid for damages through insurance. So therefore, the estimated costs are likely closer to around $245 to $280 million in response costs. What we're seeing is these numbers are growing, and this is just one type of climate event that's impacting municipalities across the province and across the country. So there are many others that we need to prepare for. Now let's talk about what you'll get out of this roadmap. This is really a roadmap 101 for people who may be from public works or other departments to confirm and identify where a municipality is at as it relates to climate change being incorporated into the infrastructure process within their municipality. It helps to determine current and future infrastructure-related hazards. It can help you obtain climate projections relevant to critical infrastructure and then tailor these to enable a really robust risk assessment. It can help you prioritize most at risk to least at risk climate-related hazards and provide you an understanding of hazards to determine appropriate actions or projects to foster your resilience. So now that we've discussed what you can get out of the roadmap, let's just take a minute to talk about what the roadmap does not do. It is not an asset-specific assessment, nor is it a municipal-wide assessment. It's somewhere in between. So it does not resolve the problem of what level of service to design to, but it does identify risks that can inform whether a level of service should be adjusted in different parts of the municipality to reflect your risk profile. It does not provide solutions to address risks that are identified. This is done separately as it's specific really to your municipality's risk profile. Now, existing frameworks that support risk and vulnerability assessments have been used in Canada that typically lend themselves to specific levels of detail and scales. So for example, ICLEI's BARC framework, and this is Building Adaptive and Resilient Communities. This is a citywide assessment, whereas something like the RPWCO protocol, the Public Infrastructure Engineering Vulnerability Committee, can be used at the asset level. Now, the RPWCO roadmap can be applied across multiple scales that are above the individual asset level to guide your assessment and prioritization of climate-related infrastructure hazards. The geographic scale at which it can be applied can be large or small, such as the neighborhood level, for example. It can also be applied across an entire infrastructure system, such as wastewater assets. So the completion of the roadmap can provide sort of a springboard for municipalities to undertake more detailed analysis. Maybe the RPWCO risk assessment, for example, for a specific asset or site that was identified to be critical or high priority through this process. It can also enable the development of specific guidance for adaptation projects or infrastructure design specifications at a later stage to address priority hazards in areas of most importance for your municipality. Now, the depth of an assessment is the level of detail or rigor that an analysis goes into. So not all components of climate change adaptation initiatives or risk assessments require a really deep dive to enable resilient decision making. That said, the deeper the analysis, the greater level of resource required, but the more specific results and outputs can be. So two pathways are considered in this roadmap, known as accelerated and detailed. And at major steps along the roadmap, a municipality can actually reselect and adjust their preferred pathway or level of detail. And there's specific guidance in the roadmap on how you can go about this if you're choosing to take that approach. So regardless of the pathway that's followed, all municipalities implementing this roadmap would follow the same steps and end up with similar outputs, but to varying degrees of detail depending on your path. So as I mentioned, the roadmap presents two pathways to choose from, accelerated or detailed. And there are a number of reasons why you may want to undertake a rapid assessment versus something that's more in-depth. So for example, if you have fewer resources or simply want more of a quick assessment to allow you to prioritize actions and proceed more quickly, you might take an accelerated path. So that said, the deeper the analysis, the greater level of resources required and time required. So when comparing the accelerated versus the detailed pathways, they differ in level of detail, resources, and time required for each step. An accelerated pathway, you would need more basic climate projections, generic research and literature. You would have a qualitative risk analysis, greater uncertainty in your results, and a heavier reliance upon staff and expert judgment. The time to complete an accelerated path through this process would be shorter. Whereas a detailed pathway, you would have more tailored as well as basic climate projections, more localized research, quantitative and qualitative risk analyses, lesser uncertainty, staff and expert judgment would be an added benefit as validation, and the time to complete would be longer. So let's talk about how the roadmap helps you scope your resilience efforts. So this roadmap has been developed such that you start broad and narrow your scope as you progress through each step. So in other words, step one does not scope your entire process up front. And this is really because adaptation can be quite complex and it requires detailed consideration of factors throughout the process, such as stakeholders and staff involvement, the assets and themes of interest to your municipality, the data availability in GIS, and other key factors prior to assessing risk and prioritizing your actions. Now, we've touched on this a little bit, but the RPWCO roadmap not only assists your municipality in meeting regulatory requirements, such as Ontario Regulation 58817 on asset management planning for municipal infrastructure, but it also provides an opportunity to plan for and design resilient spaces with multiple benefits. So in addition to assessing your infrastructure risk, you can consider other valuable contributions of building more resilient infrastructure, such as protecting biodiversity, providing recreational areas, and even contributing to more livable neighborhoods with outdoor recreation opportunities. So you have an opportunity to create spaces with multiple co-benefits, which mean they serve more than one purpose. For example, low impact development and natural areas can support flood management, water quality, and biodiversity. Now this photo here is from Thunder Bay, and it highlights the largest low impact development project to date. This area alone can treat around 7,500 cubic meters of water a year, while also providing a beautiful landscape. There's an opportunity to add elements of placemaking and environmental education, as we can see here in another example from Thunder Bay. We can also create spaces that are functional and innovative in their use of materials and technologies. And even provide an opportunity to think outside the box and design and transform spaces that are multi-purpose, highly aesthetic, and functional. So in this Danish example of how climate adaptation can be co-designed, we see here that an area that can provide stormwater solutions in a local schoolyard. It's also used for recreational and educational purposes, in addition to providing storage for floodwaters during these larger rain events. So multi-purpose, beautiful spaces. Now the roadmap provides you with best practices and case studies like this example that you're seeing here, and additional resources throughout each step of the guide. So you can expect to find links and further resources to support you as you're completing the roadmap and maybe help inspire you as you're going through this process. Appendix 1 of the roadmap contains 17 valuable activities that build off of the guidance that's provided in this document and actually demonstrate how to complete each of these steps along the roadmap. So each activity includes step-by-step instructions and refers you back to supporting text in the main body of the document. And now I'm going to pass it over to Glenn, who's going to walk you through the high-level steps through the roadmap.
Excellent. Thanks, Shelley. So just to kick things off on step one of the roadmap really is all around how can you engage your staff, your stakeholders, and set up your adaptation processes with the foresight and with a holistic approach that enables you to get kind of where you'd like to go. And so what we're just going to do is walk you through some of the subcomponents of each of these steps in the roadmap to give you a bit of a familiarity with what's discussed and the guidance that is provided. And so you'll see here as part of step one, the very first component is all around alignment with existing or establishing guiding principles or vision statements at your municipality. So considering how your adaptation efforts, your risk assessment outputs would align with your existing municipal priorities and your guiding principles. From there, the roadmap then helps you create a team, if you haven't already done so, and helps recommend the types of advisors that may be important to bring in to not only validate, but to brainstorm content as you proceed. The next component helps you evaluate how mature you are or how far along the road of adaptation at your municipality. So evaluating things like whether you've already undertaken some risk assessments, whether you've piloted certain actions, and also points to additional resources like the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Adaptation Maturity Scales. And then ultimately, the fourth component of this step helps you identify your stakeholders more broadly, but also the timing and the manner in which you hope to engage those stakeholders, which is critical. And so we recognize that not all municipalities will need to undertake step one, but it is there to provide the guidance for those that would really like to start from the beginning. So next step, or next slide rather. So the second step of the RPWCO roadmap then kind of allows you to take stock and to think about creating a bit of a municipal asset inventory. And so really documenting what assets your municipality owns, manages, operates, and maintains, identifying and leveraging whether your municipality has already defined critical assets or critical infrastructure. And then it provides some key guidance around the level of digitized or spatial data already available you might have in support of a risk assessment. And it helps you kind of come to a decision point as to what you might scope in and out of a risk assessment. And it's important as part of step two of the roadmap to recognize that you may be interested in undertaking some of these risk assessments on assets that may not be managed, owned, or operated by your municipality, but that are critical. So for example, hospitals, or electrical distribution infrastructure. So the roadmap does provide examples of some of these types of different systems and allows you to scope it based on the services that are being provided and the assets you deem to be important that are providing those services, including both gray and green infrastructure. So next slide. Step 3 then dives deep into the climate change component, climate scenario analysis to equip you to be able to undertake a risk assessment. A lot of details are provided here to help guide you on level of detail. So the very first component, as an example, asks the question and prompts you to think about whether you already have climate trends and projections. And if so, how old they are. What is the vintage of that data set that's available to you? And if you do already have those data sets in the last few years, it might be possible to leverage some of that information and to potentially just fill gaps before you proceed. But for those of you who don't have a trends report or the parameters you might need to evaluate infrastructure risk, this step then helps you scope your climate data needs, evaluate and select a climate data portal, depending on the level of detail you'd need, and then ultimately encourages you to characterize the level of climate conditions or impacts that have already occurred in your municipality. So thinking historically, what are some of the impacts and events and the hazards that have caused the impacts across your jurisdiction, documenting that and thinking about how that might inform threshold selection, for instance, as part of a risk assessment. The step D then helps you select an emissions scenario, whether you're going to think about a worst case emissions scenario or more of a mitigated future to plan for and evaluate risk for, and to ultimately obtain projections which you can then analyze to produce some scenarios. And the last component of step 3 is to ultimately think about disseminating this climate data among municipal staff. So for not only the risk assessment, but who else might benefit from looking at some of these data sets and these trends for other applications, whether they're in finance or different teams that might be key or interested in looking towards the future. Next slide. So step 4 then really dives into the risk assessment and the prioritization exercises. So it's quite an important step of the roadmap process and really breaks down the risk assessment process into a series of components. The first being background research and data gathering for the assets that you've already deemed to be in scope. And so once you've undertaken the component A, you can move forward into assessing the hazard and consequences of interest and of relevance for your jurisdiction. And once you've done that assessment, you can move into the engagement and refinement component of a risk assessment, leveraging some of the guidance from step 1 of the RPWCO roadmap, and then ultimately do that estimation of climate risk. And so the idea here is that step 4 kind of brings together the data you've already defined in step 2, the stakeholders you've identified in step 1, and the climate change analysis and scenarios you've obtained in step 3, ultimately to allow you to come up with risk assessment outputs and ratings, and to brainstorm and determine or design potential adaptation options. It provides a bit of guidance and resources on that piece as well. Next slide. And so as part of the RPWCO roadmap development, the RPWCO climate change subcommittee actually walked through a conceptual or illustrative case example from the city of Windsor. And this is just a map of the East Riverside neighborhood with a series of assets that have been plotted on it, numbered from 1 through 5. And these assets range from pollution control plants to pump stations to the marina and to roadways. But the idea here is that we wanted to leverage an existing risk assessment that the city of Windsor completed and to demonstrate how the roadmap helps you go from a system like this where you're trying to figure out priorities to the next slide, which really helps illustrate the relative priorities across this domain. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see how an evaluation of the vulnerability of these assets and a characterization of whether or not they'd be flooded under future flood conditions in the 2050s will enable you to identify relative hotspots or areas that may warrant additional investigation or consideration as part of planning efforts and analysis in the future. And so what this map is showing is really just the concentration in the relative priority areas that have a series of assets that are considered to be highly vulnerable, with consequences of them being flooded, and of course takes into consideration whether or not they'd be inundated under the 100-year event that was previously modeled through a risk assessment that the city of Windsor undertook. And so the idea here is that this visual, this type of graphic or image can then be taken to council, to senior decision makers, to equip you to have that conversation around what can we do with this information to validate it, to refine it, and to move it forward in terms of potential implementation. Next slide. And it's important to remember as you walk through this whole RPWCO roadmap that there are often high costs associated with do nothing. So we want to also create this as part of the messaging when you convey some of these risk assessment outputs. And of course, there are also opportunities to save costs as you implement when you align your adaptation efforts with other municipal operations, so perhaps the maintenance activities of your infrastructure systems. And adaptation is important and effective when you're really thinking about strategic investments in the right places and programs that may already exist or potentially creating new programs. So thinking about how you can convey the costs of the do nothing or inaction approach, and that it's better to invest now to avoid future costs or increased costs later. Next slide. And Shelley mentioned this earlier at the front end of this training session, but undertaking a risk assessment at this scale can seem very intimidating. And the RPWCO roadmap process and steps provide clear guidelines and resources to help assist you at each step of this process. So particularly scoping from that broader geographic scale down to those systems that may be particularly important for your context. And so keep these things in mind as part of step 4 of the RPWCO roadmap. Next slide. And so step 5 of the RPWCO roadmap then turns your attention to how do I apply these risk assessment outputs into my municipal mechanisms? So it's all around securing municipal supports for future implementation, for future investigations, and so on and so forth. So this can be considered identifying what municipal mechanisms exist at your municipality. So thinking about plans, programs that have particular traction or historical success stories, refining these mechanisms and specifically targeting your outputs to align with them, and ultimately allowing you to have more fulsome conversations with your staff and stakeholders around what do you want to influence out of your process, and really beginning with the end in mind as part of your risk assessment. And this entire roadmap process will enable you to do so and to think about what has historically worked in your jurisdiction or in your neighboring jurisdictions, and try to leverage from that and learn from that to leverage the outputs of your assessment process. Next slide. And just a kind of a key message here too is that good communication of assessment outputs and outcomes can really help key stakeholders, councils, staff, and other communities even understand that climate adaptation is not another cost, but should be seen as an investment. And so this is where communicating the resilient business case will be mentioned in the RPWCO roadmap process, and what are some strategies to do so. So keep this in mind if you really want some guidance on communications. And again, additional resources and external best practices are provided in the guidance document. Next slide. And so the last step of the RPWCO roadmap is step 6. And this is all around continuous learning and improvement, which is designed to be an iterative process. So it walks you through a series of components, such as the importance of establishing a monitoring, evaluation, and learning component to your work, whether that's a separate plan or a chapter within an adaptation plan or some other kind of document, and what's involved in establishing an MEL component to your work. It helps kind of prompt the need to identify key performance indicators and how to think about KPIs strategically in terms of making sure that they're specific, they're actionable, and that they're smart overall. It'll kind of emphasize the need to be transparent in this reporting as you progress through your implementation works, and really encourages you to think about the iterative nature of your efforts on adaptation, potentially regular publishing of progress reports to staff or even broader stakeholders, and ultimately provides a bit of a learning approach for you to consider as we try to move from reacting to more transformational approaches to really become more resilient. And if you go to the next slide, I'll walk you through just a little bit about that learning approach before we wrap up. And so this is a recommended kind of concept for you to think about as you proceed through the RPWCO roadmap. And the idea here is that we're trying to move from reacting to reframing to ultimately, or ideally, transforming our approaches in infrastructure systems. And so you're probably most familiar with reacting approaches to particular issues that may be existing. So identifying potential risks or issues, identifying actions to solve those issues, and then ultimately implementing those. So a good example of a reactive learning approach might be, how high do we have to raise a seawall? given sea level rise or storm surge, for example. But a better way to think about that problem would be to reframe the issue into a double loop learning approach, which the RPWCO roadmap can help prepare you to do so, and ask the question of how can we step back and what other flood management strategies exist to help us with this flood problem of storm surge? Instead of just raising that seawall, is there a better way to really look at that problem of flood management across the infrastructure and perhaps the communities in the vicinity? And what we ideally want to move to is transformation approaches around adaptation and resilience building. And this is the most difficult, but also the most important, where you step back and you examine the context, the policies, the governance structures, and the conditions under which are governing that potential risk. So for example, in the context of that seawall or that storm surge example, not just elevating the infrastructure, not just re-examining your flood management strategies, but actually looking at what are the policies in place that may be barriers to actually helping us transform? What are the resources in place that would equip us to be able to transform? And what are some of the approaches that may be novel or innovative to take? So perhaps there is a necessary managed retreat issue in a particular area. So kind of moving from that reacting to transforming. And this is an approach that's reflected throughout the RPWCO roadmap, and we'd encourage you to consider as you proceed in your adaptation efforts. Next slide. And so ultimately, the RPWCO roadmap guidance document provides some concluding messages for you to think about as you approach this process or dive into the steps that matter most to you. The first being that adaptation processes are designed to be iterative, and that is not a surprise. So we'd strongly encourage you to think about how often you might have to update reporting on your outputs, potentially update new data sets, research and analysis as part of your municipal processes. It encourages you to consider that identifying unknowns in risks and data sets are important so you can ultimately plan and prioritize across your jurisdiction. It recognizes and acknowledges that understanding best practices in adaptation can be complex, and that's why there's plenty of resources and external links provided in the RPWCO roadmap, such as the case studies. It helps you kind of prompt and kind of recommends the fact that it's important to begin with the end in mind. And that's a really important kind of facet as part of adaptation. So, before you kind of dive into data collection, risk assessment, and prioritization, what are the ultimate outputs you hope to obtain, and what are you trying to influence for implementation? And so with that.
Thank you, everyone. We encourage you to check out the subsequent training videos as part of this workshop series, and these provide more details and guidance on each step along the roadmap. Thanks very much.